excited to get us started with our very first pre-conference webinar, again, leading up to the very first virtual summit. Today's webinar is titled, Where's the Beef with Sustainability and Plant-Based Alternatives? To get us started, we have a poll question. You should be seeing that on your screen. The question is, why do you think some consumers are interested in plant-based meat alternatives? The options are health, environmental concerns, animal welfare concerns, taste, or just a variety or something different. So Dr. Place is very interested to hear what you guys think, and we'll give this just a minute for everyone to weigh in. Okay, it's a mixed bag here I'm seeing of poll results. So the answers here, the top answer from most folks is environmental concerns, followed by health, then animal welfare, and finally just looking for a variety or something different. Unsurprising that no one in this group would choose taste and think that taste would necessarily be a pro for plant-based alternatives, but kind of a mixture of others with environmental concerns being the top result, which is very relevant to today's conversation around sustainability. So I will let Dr. Place digest those poll results as she shares her remarks. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sara Place, Chief Sustainability Officer at Alanko Animal Health. Prior to starting her role at Alanko, Dr. Place was the Senior Director for Sustainable Beef Production Research at the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and an Assistant Professor in Sustainable Beef Cattle Systems at Oklahoma State University. So certainly the right person to be discussing these topics with us here today. Sara, I'll go ahead and let you share your screen.
So again, thanks very much. I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you today about this broad topic of sustainability and plant-based alternatives. And I think as that poll demonstrated, right, a lot of the reason for this kind of new generation of plant-based alternatives to be grabbing so many headlines, at least before we entered into a global pandemic, was because of the sustainability concerns around animal agriculture and a lot of the marketing position of some of these alternatives as a supposedly more sustainable option, right? So hopefully we'll kind of go through that. I thought it was interesting. Nobody thought they tasted better. That's an interesting nugget of information for sure. So that said, I hope everybody, first of all, is doing okay. This is obviously a crazy time. I think a lot of us are living on Zoom at the moment. So, you know, hope you're hanging in there, and we'll try to take our minds off of this a little bit as we kind of go through this topic. But a lot of these things I am going to talk about, they're relevant to the current events that are happening, and a lot of the disruptions that we're seeing, and the uncertainty about the future for sure. So with that said, I think it's good to just start off with what the heck is sustainability, right? What is encompassed in this big, broad term? And I like this idea of thinking about sustainability as more of this Venn diagram type model to demonstrate that there's a lot of topics that are embedded under the umbrella of sustainability, and that there are sometimes things that work together, right? Things that are a nexus that move together positively, and sometimes they're just real trade-offs. And I feel like we're not very good at grappling with trade-offs. We say that they're there, but in terms of dealing with them, it sometimes is difficult. So there's a lot going on this slide, but really what you're looking at is what's pretty broadly accepted for sustainability is it's about balancing three different main domains, right? The environment, economics, and social issues. So it's about balancing those three domains, and it's about a long-term perspective, right? We're thinking about how are we going to meet the needs of the future a decade, 2 decades, 100 years in the future, right? That's the idea of sustainability. And some of those specific topics that fall under these different domains of sustainability include things like in the environment, environmental footprints, right? So there, for example, we'd be talking about water footprints or carbon footprints. And I think that's where a lot of this conversation has been, especially when we think about alternative proteins and comparisons that are made. It's really honed in on that one top bullet point in the environment bubble, right? But there are a lot of other things that are important in the environment. Ecosystem services, that's just a fancy term for what are the benefits that we humans get from nature. And that actually comes into play big time with animal agriculture. We think about the open spaces, the forage lands, the grasslands, the biodiversity that can be supported positively or negatively by different practices, right? So that's very important. We also have a lot of other issues that, again, can be harder to quantify in the social domain, but are incredibly important, right? Everything from nutritional quality to animal welfare, the culture and traditions that people have, right? I think that's something that doesn't get a lot of respect, but that individual agency that people have and the food cultures that they come from is also very important. And on the economic side, we have to think about the viability of the folks that are actually producing food, and can people afford it, right? That's something that in this current moment, both sides of that equation are being pressured. And I think that's fundamental, right? When we think about sustainability, is if operations are not economically viable, or if people are unable to access and afford food, it's by definition, it's not going to be a sustainable system, right? So what's challenging is we're trying to balance all three of these areas, right? That's what that green blob in the middle is, right? We're trying to balance all three of these areas. It's not going to be the same for every operation. It's not going to be the same for every country, for every region. It's not going to be the same over time. And I think that's what can make this a very frustrating topic, right? Because it can be moving and a bit squishy because there are a lot of value judgments at play, right? And that's what that last bullet point is over on the far left-hand side of the screen, right? There are a lot of value judgments at play. So we could probably all agree that all of these things are important, but what does one person rank as most important versus another, right? Does that mean somebody's wrong? No, right? Somebody may rank animal welfare as their number one priority, and they will come up with a different vision of what sustainable animal agriculture looks like as compared to somebody that says, I'm going to rank affordability as food as my number one, right? So that's what makes this so difficult, is because it is subjective and it is complex. And, sustainability has kind of been the buzzword, if you will, for the last several years. But I think this current moment is also thinking about, we had to think about resilience, the resilience of a system to deal with shocks. And we're dealing with a serious kind of black swan event, if you will, at the moment, right? And how resilient is our food system, is our agricultural system? We could ask as society at this moment, right, when we have a major disruption to business as usual. And I think that's something that's important to think about too. As I go through this presentation, I'll talk about efficiency and production efficiency, which is incredibly important for sustainability and for reducing environmental impacts. But I think it's also important that we have to think about balancing efficiency with the ability to deal with shocks, right? So it's both at once. So to kind of set the stage, right, we're going to talk about alternatives. And I think what's important is just say, what are we actually eating with regard to animal source foods, both in the United States and globally, to kind of set the stage? Because I think what happens in these conversations that I see happen over and over again is there's just an implicit assumption that Americans eat too much meat. And I always, probably people find it obtuse, but I always want to push back of saying, like, what the heck is too much? What are the criteria? How do we define that? What is the quality of evidence that we're using when we say these things? I think a lot of things just get repeated over and over again and they become common knowledge, but it's always good to look at the evidence base that supports any of these assumptions that we make. So what are we eating in the US, at least pre-pandemic, right? The trends that were happening. So what you're looking at on the screen here is really just how much meat and poultry is available in the United States per person per day. And this is adjusted for losses. So this is information coming from the USDA Economic Research Service. Okay, so essentially they're saying, what is the total supply of these foods that are available? What are we estimating the losses are? And then we divide it by the number of people that are in the US, right? So again, this is a proxy for consumption. We of course don't know what every individual American's eating. It's essentially unknowable. But we can know in this broad sense what people are consuming at large. So what we're looking at is the trends from 1970 to 2016, okay? And I've called out a couple of the major colors here, the big movers, the trends. So on the bottom there, that gray color is beef. So per capita availability of beef has actually declined since the 1970s, right? So if we think about the other trends that are happening since the mid 1970s to today, the US population has increased by 100 million people, right? So there's a lot more dinner plates to spread production over, if that makes sense. So even though beef production has increased, it hasn't kept up with population growth in the United States. And so we see that availability has declined, okay, since the mid 70s. What we are eating more of is chicken, right? So Americans are eating a lot more chicken. And what's interesting is it kind of offset those two trends, right? So we're shifting our plates to more so-called white meats, right? More of the poultry and less red meat, right? In terms of beef and pork. And there's some other categories on there that are very small, right? So veal and lamb are very limited in terms of per capita availability in the United States, but those are the macro level trends, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind, right? When we think about those arguments that are made, however you may feel about them, right? If we're eating too much meat in general, if that's the case, then I guess we were eating too much in the 70s too, right? And so it's like, again, what are the criteria there in terms of how we're defining the optimum amount, right? The other thing, this is our meat and poultry. We can also look at dairy consumption, right? And so just to walk you through, what is this slide? This is ounce equivalents of dairy products, okay, per capita per day adjusted for losses. And this is also back to 1970 to today. So this is also coming from the USDA. So one caveat here, right? So you can kind of see the little headline on the blob of what's happening with dairy products. This is the actual mass of dairy products. But other things have also changed since the 70s too. The type of dairy that Americans eat has shifted, right? So back in 1970, there were a lot more Americans consuming fluid milk, right? Drinking elastic milk. And since then, over time, yes, we've had plant-based alternatives, but we've also had a lot of other competition from bottled water and soft drinks and other things that have displaced the milk that Americans were drinking, right? So actually, what we're consuming more of now is cheese, right? Yogurt. And if we think about the actual gallons of milk that are required to make those products, it's actually more gallons of milk, right? About a 10-to-1 ratio if we think about cheese. So not to confuse you, right? This is the actual products that we put in our grocery carts that we consume and the weight of those products. But the gallons of milk going into those products is actually slightly increased because we're eating more nutrient dense, if you will, versions of dairy like cheese and yogurt. So again, not to confuse you, but that's the overall trends of what's happening with dairy in the United States. So what does that look like overall? And I think this is something that's important to keep in mind, right? So there's a lot of information on this slide, and I'll show you similar data on the next couple of slides for the global situation too. But these four pie charts kind of give you an idea of, what is in the food supply. Again, just what's available. This is actually before we're adjusting for losses in the US. And what's available and what's coming from plants versus what's coming from animal source foods. So in the upper left-hand corner, we just have the total kilocalorie, the energy supply. This is all coming from the UNFAO, the energy supply of the US food supply, okay? So the key thing there is over 70% of the calories in our food supply come from plant source foods, right? So whether that's grains to fruits and vegetables, right? All those things that are derived directly from plants make up over 70% of our calories. If we were to look at protein, 65% of our protein comes from animal source foods, right? So that's hopefully kind of think about that, right? In terms of protein grams per calorie in general, right? You're always going to get more protein per calorie from animal source foods, and that's kind of reflected in these distributions, right? So a majority of our proteins coming from animal source foods, but most of our calories are coming from plant source foods. Interestingly, most of our fat is also coming from plant source foods directly. And of course, most of our carbohydrates are coming from plants as besides dairy, right? We don't have a lot of carbohydrates coming from animal source foods, right? So again, this gives you an idea of really what we are consuming or what is in our food supply as it was in 2017. And I would just say, if we think about plant-based, I think sometimes, and I'll come back to this theme a few times in the presentation, we get this bifurcation of it's either plant-based or animal-based. The reality is that most people are omnivores in the United States and the world, and we eat most of our calories from plants. And I'll be bold in my prediction and say that's not going to change anytime in the future, right? It's just easier for our food system to make calories and to make carbohydrates and make fat from plants. And what's hard for our food system to make is protein. And that's really where, from a macronutrient standpoint, where animal ag comes into play. It produces high quality protein, and it produces it in a way that's more, and oftentimes more efficient way if we think about human edible inputs, and I'll come back to that later. So just to quickly go through this is the global situation. So this is also the same kind of idea, availability per person over time. This is from 1961 to 2013, information from the FAO, okay? So you can kind of see the major trends there is what's increased are what we call monogastric, simple stomach animals, right? In terms of availability of their products per person per day, in terms of poultry meat and pork. Beef, and I put here bovine, right? So we're actually throwing in some buffalo meat, buffalo and cattle meat, small ruminant meat has been pretty steady in terms of, it's just been increasing production with population growth in the world. So per capita availability has been pretty flat over the last 50 years. And those bar charts that I just went into deep, or not bar charts, pie charts that went to deep detail about the US food supply, it's somewhat of a similar situation if we look at this globally, right? That's what these pie charts are showing you is, again, upper left is energy and upper right is protein, bottom left is fat supply, and the bottom right is carbohydrates, right? So again, the vast majority of energy supply or energy in the food supply globally for humans is coming from plants. About 40% of the world's protein is coming from animal source foods and 60% from plant source foods. And I think this is actually very interesting. Again, we're just looking at total crude protein, just the basic protein. We're not accounting for the amino acids, the quality of that protein, or how digestible it is. And quite frankly, again, animal source foods are probably providing more of those essential amino acids than the plant source foods, even though that distribution looks the way it does on the pie chart. So one of the last things I'll talk about on this, just again, that context setting of, controversial, but we're omnivores, right? And at the end of the day is that animal source foods are really, though, important, right? Even if they're not likely to provide the majority of people's calories really anywhere you are in the world, they are critical for providing protein, as I've mentioned a couple of times, and the quality of that protein, but also a lot of essential micronutrients, right? So this infographic here, this is coming from the livestock lab, a Feed the Future lab down at University of Florida. They do a lot of great work all over the world. And they've put together this nice infographic. It's got lots of information on there, but I think the key stat is up at the top there, where globally, 1 in 4 children under 5 is stunted, right? Is not able to meet their full potential, both mentally and physically, right? And there's lots of reasons for that, as that little pie chart in the middle says, right? There's educational reasons, there's water, cleanliness issues, but food is important too. The food supply and the nutrient availability in the food supply for people around the world. And what we know is that animal source foods, again, they're providing a lot of those key micronutrients that are needed for cognitive development, physical development, things like vitamin B12, iron, right? In very, again, available forms. And I think that's what we had to keep in mind is sometimes this conversation about plant-based alternatives and changing people's diets is a very Western and wealthy country view. And we're not probably paying attention to the reality that we have 2 billion people in the world with micronutrient malnutrition, right? And that's like an actual big problem that we have that is holding people back from reaching their full potential. So with that said, shifting gears a little bit, I kind of want to address some of these key topic areas that are related to sustainability and a lot of sometimes the marketing material that you see from plant-based alternatives, and try to separate fact from fiction and show the complexity of the truth of the situation, right? So one of the key things is the idea that with plant-based alternatives that we're going to reduce the amount of resource competition or feed food competition, right? So the idea that if we take out the middleman, right? Like this jersey that's looking at us on the screen right now, if we take out the middleman, we'll have more plants available for us to just eat directly, right? So that's often the argument that's made that will increase food security because we will just just eat plants directly, not lose energy by feeding it to animals. So what is the truth there? What's actually happening? And I think what's key is just to start just with this idea of really I put on here cattle, but really what are livestock doing, right? Livestock they're acting as upcyclers. Okay, so what does that mean? We've all heard of recycling, right? Taking something that's of little, or taking something that's of equivalent value, making something of equivalent value, right? Recycling a tin can, for example. Upcycling is taking something that's of little or no value and making a higher value product, right? And if we think about the very macro level picture of what animal agriculture is doing, that's what animals are doing, right? They're taking less desirable, less digestible, right? Plants that have fewer concentrations of essential nutrients or no essential nutrients in regard to vitamin B12, for example. And they're concentrating those nutrients and upgrading those nutrients, right? In the form of animal source food products. So if we think about agriculture at its most basic level, right, this kind of diagram, this flow diagram in the middle of the screen, right, really what agriculture is a solar energy capture process, right? We all depend on plants, whether we like to eat animal products or not, to capture solar energy and the health of the soil, right, in terms of the nutrients that are in the soil, and capture that energy and then use it for other things, for food and fiber, for biofuels. And what cattle and other ruminant animals are super unique at is they take that human inedible solar energy, the cellulose, right, that is stuff that we cannot digest. And with that microbial relationship that they have, they are able to make all these food products that are, again, very nutrient dense, and all the ancillary products that come from animal agriculture too, right? Manure is a valuable resource to feed back into crop production, right? To feed the soil, to leather, to pharmaceuticals, whatever it may be. The other thing that's on this slide, the little pie chart down in the bottom, or the donut chart, is just a kind of a case study, and I'll expand on this a little bit later, of what do cattle actually eat in the US, right? So this is a beef cattle specific breakdown, right? Grain finished beef cattle in the United States. One thing that sometimes surprises people is even though we talk a lot about grain finishing and corn-fed beef in the US, the vast majority of the animal's life is spent, of course, on grass, and that's where they start their life. And even when they're in a feed yard situation, they're still consuming forage. So how that all adds up is about 82% of what grain-finished cattle actually eat is forage, right? Most of that is grazed forage, but any hays or silage, which is essentially fermented whole plants, right, like the whole corn plant, that's what makes up the bulk of their feed. Another 7% are all those byproducts or leftovers, if you will, that get used in animal agriculture. And this is important for ruminants and for our simple stomach animals, our pigs and chickens, in terms of the byproduct feeds that they use. So it can be things like dried distillers grains for methanol production to wheat midds, right, for milling wheat. Essentially the parts of the plant that we don't want to eat or can't eat that can then be fed to livestock and upcycled and upgraded into another product. And then only about 11% of what grain finished cattle eat in the US is actually grain, which again surprises people, but that's just the reality of ruminant production. Is it makes a lot more sense to use some of these less desirable feedstuffs and take advantage of their ability with the microbes that they have in their gut to use these different feedstuffs. So that's the US situation. The situation globally is very similar, right? So what we're looking at here is information from a publication from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, where they looked at the global ruminant feed system, right? So ruminant animals are cattle, sheep, goats, buffaloes, right? All of those animals together. So they consume a lot of feed, right? 4.9 million tons of dry matter, right? It's hard to visualize how much that is. It's a lot of feed, but the vast majority of it, 95% of it, is stuff that is not in direct competition with human food, right? So think back to that idea of are we in direct competition or not? And that's a key stat to remember. And some of the other things that are on here, again, this is not to be either or about ruminants or monogastric animals, but it just shows that they're, as I'll show on the next slide, right? Monogastric animals tend to be more efficient at using feed, but they have to use feedstuffs that are going to be more in direct competition with human beings, right? So that's what the stat is here. Essentially, it takes less human edible protein to make 1 kilo, right? Less than 1 kilo to make 1 kilo of protein for ruminants, which is pretty awesome. And we'll kind of go on that a little bit more on this next slide, right? So there's a lot of information here, but I think this is really key. And this again highlights the subjectivity of sustainability and how what metric you choose, you can get a different answer, and you can kind of fit your bias too, right? Which is important to be transparent about how some of these things are viewed and why it's important to show a whole suite of information. So what's going on this slide is over on the far left, we're essentially comparing 4 different animal types, okay? We're comparing grain-finished beef in the US, dairy cow system, this is actually information from a UK publication, to broiler chickens to pork, okay? And again, none of this is to say one is better than the other, it's just to highlight how complex this is, okay? So this first column that's in black, okay, these are the pounds of feed dry matter per pound of live weight gain, okay? So just how many pounds does it take for this animal to gain a pound or to make a pound of fresh milk, okay, in the case of the dairy cow. So you can see clear differences, especially with beef cattle compared to their counterparts, the other meat animals of chickens and pigs, right? It takes more feed to make ruminant meat, whether it's beef or lamb, compared to monogastric animals. That's not controversial, right? That's just basic biology. And this number, I should say, is a life cycle number, right? So it's not a feedlot feed conversion number. This is taking into account cow-calf and stocker phases of the industry, those grass-based phases of the industry. So that's interesting. And a lot of times people will stop here, right? And again, say, wow, well, we could save a lot of resources if we switch products or if we just didn't use these animal products. But again, this isn't really getting to the heart of the issue and the concern about this, which is competition with human food, right? So if we were to look at the middle column, this is the pounds of potentially human edible feed, okay, that is fed to these animals per pound of live weight, okay? So you'll notice a lot of those dramatic differences kind of go away, right? At least for the meat producing animals, it's very similar across all 3 species in terms of the human edible inputs that are going into these animal systems, okay? And I say potentially human edible, right? Most people would rather consume bacon than a corn soy mix, but this is about theoretically, if you had to eat it, could you eat it from that standpoint? So this third column, this is a little bit of a weird concept at first, but essentially this is taking how I've been talking about feed conversion efficiency and flipping it on its head, okay? And saying, what is the protein value to people, okay? Meaning, what are the essential amino acids, the building blocks of this protein that are contained within these animal products, and how available are they to you when you consume them, okay? So what is the protein value of beef or milk products or chicken or pork compared to that same protein value score of the feed inputs that are going into the animals? So hopefully that makes sense as you're thinking about this, and it's called out at the top, right? A higher number, in this case above 1, means we're actually making more high quality protein than we're using. So you'll note this is kind of where ruminants have an advantage, right? Because they're able to consume essentially really poor quality protein sources when they are eating human edible feed, right? If we think about corn grain, it's actually a very poor quality protein source if we were to eat it. Their number looks a little bit better, right? Compared to monogastric omnivorous animals, right? Throwing a lot of terms at you, but that's what humans are too, right? We're simple stomached omnivores, and that's actually what chickens and pigs are too, right? So they need to eat high quality protein, and so they tend to eat more soybean meal and other high quality protein sources, and that drives this ratio down a little bit, right? So again, none of this is to say that there's one is better than the other, but it highlights the trade-offs, right? Ruminant animals are going to produce methane gas, and that's the trade-off with their ability to upcycle a little bit better. The greenhouse gas emissions per unit of production are going to be lower for pigs and chickens, but they're going to have more competition with human edible feed, right? So again, hopefully that highlights some of these things are complex, and it's not as easy as some of the bumper sticker type headlines that get thrown out there. The other thing is when we think about feed, usually the logical next question is, okay, well, what about the land, right? What about the land that's required to produce all these different items? And what's key to remember and to think about is, again, animal agriculture really isn't separate from crop agriculture. any improvements that are made in crop production also translate into potentially positive effects in animal agriculture if we think about the whole life cycle of production, right? So what's going on in this slide here, this is just information from the USDA comparing 1975 to 2017, okay? So at the top we have what the USDA estimates is essentially the leftover corn that they assume is going to animal feed. It's what's called feed and residual use. So you'll see there's actually been an increase over time, right? We've got a 52% increase in feed and residual corn use in the United States. But if you look at the next row down, right, corn yields, bushels per acre, that's increased 104%, right, over that same time frame. So what that means is that even though we're using more absolute corn to feed all of our livestock in the United States, the land area that's required to grow that corn to support all those animals has actually shrunk 26%, right? So that's pretty incredible in terms of what we can think about as like decoupling the total production from the resources that are going into the system. So despite that reduction in land use, you guys can see at the bottom, right, the takeaway there that we've increased the total red meat, poultry, dairy production 95% in this country, right? So that efficiency, as I said earlier, efficiency alone is not sustainability, but it is a key part. If we're going to feed an increasing number of people, you have to think about these things, right? Of how are we going to get the most value in a responsible manner from the resource inputs that we're putting into a system. So the other thing about land use, and this is where I think when people talk about so-called land footprints, for example, we say how many acres of land it takes to produce a given product, that actually is a pretty low informational value metric, if you will, because it's missing important context, okay? And so some of these important items is one, we have to think about the suitability of lands for different uses, right? So I have some pictures in the background there, but in that upper right-hand corner or upper left-hand corner, that's in southern Arizona, right? Rangeland, really rocky territory. We're not going to be able to grow peas or broccoli or something else in that kind of landscape, right? We had to think about how can land be used in the most suitable manner. We also have to think about multifunctional land use, right? So again, with a lot of our grazing ruminant systems in the US and around the world, they support a lot of biodiversity, but they support a lot of wildlife habitat. It's not agriculture or working or wildlife landscapes, right? Working lands can support wildlife habitats, right? They can coexist. And we also have many examples of integration of livestock with croplands, right? Whether it's cattle, whether it's other livestock species. Obviously, the basic example of the manure going back to the lands, but also having animals use some of the crop residues. Again, they're left over after we've harvested the crops that we maybe want to eat directly, right? It's the stubble, the residue that is human inedible stuff. And one example there in that bottom right-hand corner, that really green pasture that those animals are grazing on, right? If we think about the southern Great Plains in the United States, there's a lot of winter wheat that is grown in that region. And a lot of those wheat acres are actually dual purpose, right? Which means the wheat will be planted, and after it grows a bit, animals will actually be grazed on that wheat land, right, for a few months. And then the animals will be taken off that land, right? So we've produced a bit of beef on that acre. And then that grain can grow up and be harvested, right, combined, right, for human use in terms of being milled into flour that we can then use for bread or whatever else the products may be, right, that we're producing from that acre of land. So I think that's important, and that a little way to think about it, right? You can have 1 acre of land that can produce the bun and the burger, right? So it's not either or, it's how those things fit together, right, in that system. And then finally, the quality of use, right? So in this case, minimizing the amount of land, even though it can be important overall, it's not always a win, right? If we think about, we could be minimizing the amount of land used to produce food, but if that means that we're plowing it every single year, we're not providing the best conservation practices just because we're trying to maximize short-term yields, then that's not ultimately going to be sustainable in the long term, right? So we have to think about all balancing these things at once. So I think the next thing that's key to talk about is just a lot, again, this idea of we need alternatives is driven by an idea that one, we eat too much, two, that there's this resource competition that we need to address, and three, I would say it is this idea that ultimately animal agriculture cannot improve enough to meet the growing demand in the world. So therefore we need to reduce demand, right? I think that's kind of an embedded assumption that's also at play in some of these conversations that are happening. So one is just to highlight, there is a lot of geographic variability within the United States, but definitely around the world in terms of how efficient different production systems are, right? Again, efficiency isn't everything with sustainability, but it is a key component of it. So what we're looking at here, this is information from a publication that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences a few years ago, looking at greenhouse gas emission intensity, greenhouse gas emissions per unit of beef, okay? And if you can't really make out that scale at the bottom, essentially the darker greens, like in the United States, North America, Western Europe, have lower carbon footprints. That lighter green is kind of intermediate carbon footprints, and then the purple in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the Indian subcontinent, are carbon footprints that can be 50 times greater than in the United States and Western Europe, okay? So there's huge variation in the efficiency of production of beef around the world, of bovine meat around the world, and that translates into things like greenhouse gas emissions per unit of beef too. So not to go too much in the weeds there, but a lot of it is just driven by basic animal husbandry practices, right? How many live animals do you need to produce a given amount of product? So this is, again, not to knock on any other countries in the world, because people raise livestock for a variety of different reasons, right? It may be more for equity, for wealth, than for just pure production. But if we were to compare the US to Brazil, right? The US is the #1 beef producer in the world, and Brazil is #2. We produce about 5 billion more pounds of beef than Brazil, but their cattle herd is twice the size as the United States, right? So they produce less beef and they have twice as many cattle in Brazil as compared to the US. And that really drives a lot of these things that the color schemes you're seeing on the screen there, right? If you have twice as many cattle, you have twice as many cattle that have to consume feed, that are belching out methane every day, and that drives these differences that you see across the world. So that's beef. It's similar with dairy, right? So just a couple examples, and not to go through every single species and beat the point to death, but you get the idea that a lot of these differences that you see on the map, again, the dark green in North America and Western Europe compared to other parts of the world. Again, this is not to put down other parts of the world, but rather just to highlight that there's a gap, a productivity gap, that if we can close that gap, we can make a lot more progress globally in terms of reducing the total footprint of animal agriculture, reduce that total footprint, and still produce a lot of high quality nutrition to nourish people around the world. So things vary geographically, things vary over time too. So just like that corn example that I showed you, things aren't static. And that's one of the other challenges with this conversation, is where we are today is definitely no guarantee of where we're going to be tomorrow. And we can see that when we look at these data historically, right? So what's going on this slide, this is just a US dairy example, right? What we have in these little blue dots are the dairy cows in the United States. So how many dairy cows we had in the US. So back in the 1940s, we had 26 million dairy cows in the United States. Now we have about 9.3 million. And yet we produce twice as much milk, total milk in the United States, right? So that major shift has been driven by a whole bunch of things, right? The genetics of the animals, the quality of the feedstuffs, the health of the animals, cow comfort, right? Cows that are more comfortable in a better environment tend to produce more milk. So all of these things together are feeding into this kind of impressive statistic, right? That one cow in 2019 equals 5.8 cows in 1924, right? So if we were going to try to produce as much milk as we did today, right, with the efficiency of the good old days back in the 1920s, okay, we would have a cattle herd of almost 60 million head, right, of dairy cows, right? So that's a lot to say that. It's a lot more methane, that's a lot more feed. And again, that's where efficiency is a key component of this whole thing. So if we think about improvement opportunities, we have a lot of opportunities to improve still in the United States. We're definitely not perfect here. We have a lot of things that we can work on and continue to get better, but definitely globally, the whole animal agriculture industry has a lot of areas to improve. So this information here, just these different areas that we have as opportunities to keep improving on the left-hand side, and the stat, that quote, is all coming from a UN Food and Agriculture report that came out in 2013, which is a really good report. It's got a lot of information on this topic and really lists out some of those key drivers, right? As I mentioned before, genetics, animal feeding, feed processing is very, very important. How digestible is that feed to the animals? Feed additives, biotechnology, right? Just the management, the husbandry, the health, the welfare of the animals is really key, right? We have some stats out there of we're essentially losing 20% of farm animals around the world still to mortality, to disease. So improving animal health means that we're going to use our natural resources much more wisely. So you guys can see that. And the key stat over here, which is kind of amazing, but we have the potential, and this comes from that report, to reduce the total emissions, the absolute emissions from global animal agriculture, 30%. Okay, if we can shift production towards more efficient systems and keep the overall output constant, right? So this is this whole idea of this decoupling that I mentioned earlier of we can produce more with less, we can produce the same with fewer resource inputs if we keep improving the supply side of the equation. And I think, again, that's what's key, is that we can't underestimate how much more we can improve. Again, the United States, we're very efficient, but we can still improve, but globally we can improve quite a bit more. And just to belabor this point, but just to finish this section up, really that's the headline, right? Is that there's an inverse relationship between the productivity of the system, for example, how much milk per cow you're making, and the greenhouse gas emissions intensity and a lot of the environmental impacts, right? So to orient yourself on this chart, on the vertical axis here, we just have what we can think of as the carbon footprint, right? How much greenhouse gas emissions get emitted per unit of milk, right? So higher numbers are less desirable, versus the productivity of the cows on the horizontal axis here, on the x-axis. So how many kilograms of milk are they making per year? So as production increases, right, we lower the amount of greenhouse gas emissions per unit of milk.
Hey, Sarah, I don't want to cut you off, but we do have several questions, so I'll let you wrap up. And we will, folks, I'll just let you know, as long as Dr. Place has some time, we can hang out after 2 o'clock to wrap up some of the questions here. Everything is being recorded, so if you do need to hop off, again, totally respect your time, but want to let her finish her thoughts and then get to as many questions as we can. So we probably are going to end up going a little bit past that 2 o'clock point, but again, everything is being recorded, so if you need to jump off, you certainly can, and you'll be able to catch up later. So I will let you finish up, Sarah.
Sure, great. So to kind of get to the heart of the matter, right, in terms of what about dietary change or what about these alternatives? And I just want to say, first of all, like, this is not anti-plant alternatives or anything like that. You know, you do you. If you want to eat different things, I think that's great, right? But it is cutting to the matter of, are these things more sustainable? These are alternatives or imitation products more sustainable, or what impact does any of this have? And I think the headline really is, especially when you think about climate change, if that's a major impetus of why people are making these choices, to sum it all up, you can't eat your way out of climate change, right? I mean, you can eat a ribeye steak every day or just eat tofu, and it's really just not going to scale to anything. Not to disempower people, but it's not a big driver at the end of the day, right? So just to emphasize that, I think if we think about some of the major companies that are out there in the last few years, and we think about their marketing materials right up in the upper right-hand corner, just as that poll question at the beginning talked about, right? These are kind of the greatest hits of how these things are being marketed. They're marketing based on improving human health, positively impacting climate change. So this is marketing materials from Beyond Meat. It says CO2 superscript. If anybody knows their chemistry, that's obviously incorrect. Addressing global resource constraints. This is why I spent so much time talking about food competition, because this is a key area that they're marketing on. And they say we're improving animal welfare because their products aren't coming from animals. So I guess they improved animal welfare, right? So again, that's kind of the heart of the matter of how these next generation products are being marketed, right? They're being marketed on sustainability issues. That said, it's kind of the obligatory picture, right? I think there's been a lot of photos like this snapped over the last several weeks of meat case photos and what's left and what's not left in these situations. And I think the situation has changed several times over in the last several weeks, right? Where we didn't have actual supply constraints and we had more quote unquote panic buying, versus now we actually do have supply constraints on the meat side, right? But it is telling in terms of what people will choose, right? And the main takeaway is, again, people are omnivorous. They probably want to consume animal source foods. Folks will consume plant-based proteins, but there hasn't been any clear evidence in the last several years of any sort of serious displacement of animal source foods with imitation type products or alternative products, right? Especially on the meat side of things. So I think that's what's always key to keep in mind is a lot of people are trying to tell marketing stories on all sides of the issue, but what do the data actually show? We don't have any clear evidence that there has been a lot of substitution happening. And that's key because that's one of the key arguments of this whole sustainability argument, is that we're going to get massive substitution of animal agricultural products that's going to decrease animal agricultural output and then somehow affect greenhouse gas emissions. That's essentially the steps of that argument. And I think this study here, it's people have tried to throw bombs at it, but I think it kind of pulls it all together in a good way that zooms out to the most macro level and says just what is possible with dietary change. So this was a publication that came out a few years ago in the National Academies of Sciences, and just looked at, it's a completely unrealistic scenario, but it gives you the upper threshold of what if every American went vegan. And if every American went vegan in the United States and we eliminated all of animal agriculture, greenhouse gas emissions would only be reduced by 2.6 percentage points, okay? It's less than 0.5% of global emissions. And the other challenge with this, though, speaking of back to trade-offs, is that we would not have enough essential micronutrients in our food supply, especially things like vitamin B12, to nourish everybody, right? If we take animals completely out of the system, right? So again, this is not a realistic scenario, but it's a scenario that sets the upper bound of the threshold of what's possible. And hopefully that makes sense to people. If this is the magnitude of the greenhouse gas emission effect in America from eliminating every single farm animal that there is, what is going to be the impact of someone switching one burger to an Impossible Burger or doing Meatless Mondays or whatever, right? Again, people may have their own personal reasons of what they're consuming. That's great. But it's just important to be clear-eyed that the magnitude of the absolute effect is vanishingly small, right? Or non-existent when we think about it. So I think a lot of the way this has been framed is kind of a little bit, in terms of this competition between the two, is, in my opinion, a little bit silly, right? Because at the end of the day, again, most people are going to consume animal source foods. They're going to get the majority of their calories from plant source foods. And the two things are intertwined, not just on our plates, but also how they're produced in the supply chain. And just to highlight an example of that, right? If we think about 3 breakfast beverages, right? We had orange juice, we had almond milk, and regular milk. And I put in there, right, a little tongue-in-cheek, the original plant-based milk, right? Cow's milk. How are these things actually connected? And if we think about a state like California, a major dairy state, about 1 in 5 gallons that are produced of milk in the United States come from California. This connection is very apparent, right? When we think about the production, the juicing of oranges to make orange juice, or we think about almonds, right? They don't come just like this off the tree, right? They have holes that are surrounding the nut itself. So they have leftovers that they produce, right? They have byproducts that they produce. And what happens to a lot of these byproducts, right? The citrus pulp or the almond hulls, well, they actually end up in the diets of cattle, right? And the diets of dairy cattle. And that's a big reason why the dairy industry is so large in California, is because it developed to use all these byproducts from the 400 specialty crops that are grown within that state. And that stat that's on the screen there, right? For every 100 pounds of human food that comes from crops, 37 pounds of byproducts get developed, right? So again, the takeaway there is just that these things are intertwined, right? It's not either or, it's rather how they all fit together. And I think that's what's super key, is thinking about that cycle and how animals fit within the system. So plant-based alternatives are another option for folks. The reality is that people are probably going to get most of their most of their protein requirements still from animal source food. So it's more about improving the supply chain side of things is going to have a bigger impact on sustainability than changing people's diets. So I know you've popped up again, Hannah. I know I just keep rambling on. And so I will stop now to take questions. So yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Again, folks, totally understand if you need to jump off, but I can see that the vast majority of you are still on the line. So we will go ahead and jump into the really great questions that are in the Q&A box. Our attendees never let us down. Again, everything is being recorded, so if you do have to jump off, you can certainly catch up later. Again, you can upvote other questions. So if you see some of these questions that you would like an answer to, give them a thumbs up. And the most popular question is, how do you see people perceiving the food system after living through the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, so I think this whole thing has taken people, if we all think about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's taken us down to the bottom of the pyramid, right? Back to our basic essentials. And I think that has driven a lot of the thankfulness that people feel from everyone in the food system, from people that are grocery store workers to processing plant workers to the farmers. And I think it's going to get people back to the basics of what do they really want, right? So a lot of the photos that we've seen, or we've probably all been to the grocery store, it's anecdotal, but I think we've seen a lot of people just going for the option that makes the most sense, right? People have been under financial distress, a lot of cases in the United States. And so they're looking for what is the nutritious thing for me to feed my family and what's the least cost, right? So the basics of eggs, of milk, those type of staple items have been going off the shelves at retail places pretty quickly, right? The challenge and the complexity is the food service impacts. And I just don't think we're going to know, how this all shakes out, if people are going to go back to spending a lot of their food income at restaurants, right, at quick serve places, or if we're going to see more of a permanent shift a little bit back to where we used to be with a higher proportion of the dollar coming from retail. I think that's kind of unknowable at the moment, but that's going to be something to watch.
Our attendees definitely have current circumstances on the brain, because our second most popular question is, what are your thoughts on consumers thinking on the concept of sustainability as they shopped in the early days of the pandemic? Do you think very many consumers thought very much about that as they filled their freezers with meat?
Yeah, so I think they were a good question, Ron. I think they were thinking about sustaining themselves, right, at the end of the day. And hopefully that makes sense, as we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, right? It's all these different areas that people are balancing. And I think when we have a major shock to the system like this, what comes up and bubbles up as priority number one is, how am I going to feed my family, take care of my family, provide good nutrition? And again, that's why I think a lot of people rated the meat case, right? So they're like, I'm going to stock up. I know I can, fill my freezer even if I don't have a big freezer. And I think the issue itself is still going to be important, right? But it's been pretty consistent that it's something that's lower than affordability, taste, nutrition. Those things are always at the top of people's minds.
I live on the eastern shore of Maryland, where there are many poultry companies, and many of them are doing truckload sales. And I personally sat in a 2-hour-long line and didn't get any chicken, and then had to go back to a different one. So people certainly want meat. I think of that every time now when you hear the exaggerated statistics of people going vegan and cutting meat, as well, they obviously have never sat in a line for 2 hours and not been able to even buy any chicken.
Yes.
As lots of people are right now.
Yep.
Another related question, have our efforts to reduce our carbon footprint, so shorten the supply chain, left our food system, specifically meat and poultry, more vulnerable to business disruptions such as COVID-19?
So I think part of this is also going to be something that we're going to study in the future, and in terms of understanding that, right? But hopefully that makes sense too, of what I tried to talk about at the top of, there is at times a conflict between resilience of a system and efficiency of a system, right? By definition, in a lot of cases, to be more resilient, you're going to have redundancy built into a system. And redundancy is inefficiency, right? So I think there is some sort of balance there of thinking about our supply chains and how they can be altered perhaps to provide more flexibility. Part of it is just like with everything in society. I don't know about you guys, but if somebody had told me in January that all this would be happening, you wouldn't believe them, right? It's almost like a failure of imagination. I think that's part of the human condition, that we just can't even imagine something like this would have happened, right? So it's hard for us to plan and think about that resiliency when it seems like a completely unrealistic scenario. And I think going forward, since we've all lived through this, there will be more eagerness to actually do those type of planning exercises, because we know it's possible now.
Great. Moving off of that subject for the next question, how has the food balance, plant versus animal sources, changed over time? Has there been a larger or smaller percent of plant-based energy, fat, cholesterol in the past? I believe that's cholesterol, could be carbohydrates, or cholesterol in the past as compared to today?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I use my scientific CHO as carbohydrates. So in terms of how they've changed over time, there has been some shifts. It depends on what country you're looking at specifically, right? Interestingly, the major shift over time in the United States, as I kind of showed over the last 40 years, we really haven't been consuming a lot more calories of animal source foods. That's been pretty stable. The supply of calories from plant source foods in our food supply has increased. And the amount of fat that we're getting from plant source foods in a country like the United States is actually increased, right? So if we think about things like soybean oil, canola oil, that's actually increased in our food supply relative to animal fats, right? So we're just not consuming as many traditional animal fats like lard, for example, as we were back in the early 20th century.
I just made homemade tortillas for the first time the other day, and the recipe called for lard. I don't even know where to get that, so I just use Crisco, which is sacrilege probably for this group. Another great question. There's actually two questions, so I'll kind of combine them, very similar. So you gave us a lot, and you always do this every time I hear you speak, so much great scientific information and studies and resources. How do we boil all that down into quick sound bites, tweets, whatever that is? How do we we can't put you in our pocket and bring you with us everywhere. So how do we take what you've shared and kind of put it into easily digestible things to share?
Yeah. And I apologize. I always go information overload. That's my MO. But I think when we think about this, it's those key headlines, right? Of just livestock are upcyclers, right? And I kind of put that in some of the slides there at the end, right? About milk being a plant-based product, right? That's kind of a provocative thing to do, but I think if you really want to start a conversation with people, you can do that, right? I'm just saying, we already make plant-based meat on our operation. It's called pork or it's called beef. And you'll get some head scratching there, but I think that opens the doors of leading with that kind of statement to just explain the system, right? I think people just genuinely don't understand the basics of how these different animal species are raised. There's a lot of confusion about it, and sometimes misinformation that causes people to change their eating habits, right, in that way. And I think it's just about showing people what we're doing, right, in animal agriculture. And so leading with some of those quick statements about, boom, an affirmative, we already are doing a lot of upcycling in this industry. And the people are like, what does that mean? And then just leading into that discussion about, we use all these byproducts that would otherwise be waste, right? And this is how we do it. And this is how we balance this to meet the animal's needs. So I think that's the key, is even though I hit you with all that information, is just start with those top level headlines.
Excellent. Most folks are still on the line. So as long as you have time, Sarah, we'll keep busting out questions here. Perfect. Okay. How do our animal protein consumption trends in the US compare to other regions? Like, do we eat more white meat, others eat more red meat, or vice versa? Or kind of what does it look like in other countries?
Yeah. So in general, kind of an over generalization, but in most of the developed countries, this trend has been pretty similar, where the amount of red meat, and especially ruminant meat, has declined proportionally over time. And the amount of white meat has increased, right? So I think part of it, we've gotten a lot of nutritional messaging that has driven some of that. And I think the other part of it is there are realistic supply side constraints of how much ruminant meat we can make when we think about lamb and beef, that it is tied to our forage availability, right? So there's a couple things happening at once there in terms of that shift. And there's obviously, it's easy to say that in general, but then there's all sorts of things that can happen, whether it's, African swine fever can dramatically change, right, the consumption profile and what's taking place in China, which is interesting. We've seen more displacement of beef actually into that market than poultry, which is interesting, but I think that also goes back to there's lots of cultural differences, right? Just in general, for example, most of Europe just eats a lot more pork than the US, right? They're a lot bigger pork eaters than we are. And we just historically have eaten more beef, and it's just a cultural thing. And it's also tied to the vast grassland resources that we have in the US.
Great. How do we address the argument that land used to grow animal feed could be converted to grow human edible plants instead?
Yeah, so hopefully that makes sense when I was talking about the feed consumption. Even though that wasn't showing you acres, it's kind of getting at that same question, right? So there's actually more quote unquote competition there if we think about some of our monogastric animals, but those animals are still eating a lot of byproduct feeds too. And I think that's what's key, is that when we get into those byproducts, it's not really one of the animals driving versus what are people doing. It's how that system works together, right? For ruminant animals specifically, they're kind of the ones that get most of the attention when it comes to land use. But the vast majority of land used for cattle production is land that cannot be cultivated, or it's land that if we did cultivate it, right, if it's a hay field or pasture that theoretically, say maybe in the eastern US, yeah, we could plow it. But that comes back to that quality of use portion, right? There's probably a reason why it's in grass. It's highly erodible. And I think that's some of those complexities to tell people that even though we frame this as either or, it's not either or, right? And it's just providing sometimes it's just simple as snapping a photo, right? That picture tells the story better than anything, of just saying, this is what the land actually looks like, right? That we're using. And it's supporting wildlife, or it's supporting crops and livestock at the same time.
Excellent. We'll keep going for maybe 5 or so more minutes just to wrap things up. There are still questions actually coming in even as we speak.
Okay.
So speaking of, as we just touched on, what's going on in other parts of the world, can you speak to what may be happening to close the production gap in other parts of the world?
Yeah, so some of those things that were listed on that slide as we were talking about what are the opportunities, that's really where a lot of that action is. And that group that I mentioned, the Sustainable Livestock Lab, they're one of the research institutes that's out there. Different groups called like ILRI is out there. Obviously, each of those nations have their own, in a lot of cases, efforts to improve the productivity of livestock production. And sometimes I think we get like overly excited about it's going to be some sort of new technology that we're going to deliver to people, but it's more about thinking about how do we adapt, the husbandry practices we know work to different areas, right? And it's not just we're going to take a Holstein from, Wisconsin and drop her into Kenya and expect her to do the same thing, right? We have to think about the feed resources that are in different areas. How can we improve all of those incremental steps and reproduction, all those animal husbandry aspects, right? That's really where the key is. And I would just say, for me, it's thinking about, you got to put the funding into it, right? Because if you look at the funding of some of these international efforts compared to the funding of even plant-based alternatives, I mean, the ROI on human development it's not matched by the investment, right? Like we would improve a lot more people's lives if we invested in agriculture in these places, I would argue, and help them be more self-sufficient than a lot of the money that's been put into some of these fancy technologies. So,
great point. So last question from the Q&A box. I've been seeing so many things on social media discussing how much air quality has improved with pollution decreasing in our world since we've all had to stay home to stay safe. Can animal ag capitalize on this shift, knowing that pre-COVID animal ag was being blamed, but post-COVID we are seeing tangible improvement with limited auto and air travel? What do you think?
Yeah, so a couple of things there. One is a lot of those headlines that we're seeing, sometimes they're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, which is what we usually are talking about when we talk about animal agriculture and emissions. But a lot of the change that we've seen is actually with other air pollutants. So things like nitrogen dioxide, air pollutants that affect air quality. And if any of you all live in cities, you may have seen that yourself, right? Of the air quality looks better, right? Visibility is better, improved. And we've seen that in our measurements. So what is key is that we know those particulates, most of them come from burning fossil fuels, as is true with greenhouse gas emissions, right? So I think there's an opportunity to, in some cases, make those percentages that we talk about, right, of agriculture in general in the United States only being about 9% of emissions, animal agriculture being about 4 or 5% of emissions. It's one thing to say that. It's another to see the dramatic difference, right? When we dramatically reduce transportation and the amount of fossil fuels that we're burning, we see dramatic reductions in particulates that cause air pollution, that cause human health issues, and we can document reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, right? So I think it just makes it more tangible for folks and highlights the essentiality of agriculture, right? We got to eat. Doesn't matter if you're eating plant-based foods or animal source foods, you have to eat, right? That's not optional. Flying on a vacation somewhere is optional, but eating is not.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate all of our virtual summit speakers. And in your honor, we have made a donation to Feeding America. Obviously, their work is very important all the time, but especially with everything going on right now. So in honor of our really outstanding lineup of summit speakers, the Alliance has made a donation to them. So thank you so much, Sara, for joining us and offering your insights today.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.